This is a sports catastrophe production.
This is a dark moment in sports history. The following sports catastrophe on this day contains some very bad things about terrorism and the peace of the Olympics and a editorial about Avery Brundage, who was the IOC president at the time. Do note that this is really hard for me to swallow by doing tragedy in such a sense, but please understand that this is something we have to talk about. Hey there, Heather, ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Diamond welcoming you to another sports catastrophe on this day. Now, I know this technically didn't happen on September 4th. I remembered it incorrectly, and I put it down in my notes that on this day for the Munich massacre in 1972. However, because the 5th and the 6th have both had very good moments in it, I'm not going to replace it. Basically, I just want to tell you about this a couple days before the close to 50th anniversary of this thing. This happened 49 years ago in 1972 during the Summer Olympics. 8 members of the Palestinian terrorist group Black September took 9 members of the Israeli team hostage after killing 2 in the Olympic Village. So, anyway, Black September demanded the release of 234 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, and the West German held founders of the Red Army faction. However, it failed. 5 of the 8 Black September members were killed during the attempt to rescue the hostages, but it failed. All of them were killed. A West German policeman was caught in the crossfire. They found the 3 surviving perpetrators. However, the next month, after a hijacking of Lufthansa Flight 615, the West German government released them in a hostage exchange. The Israeli government launched Operation Wrath of God, which had Mossad track down and kill those who were in the Munich massacre, basically the National Intelligence of Israel. So, anyway, the hostages were taken during the second week of the 1972 Summer Olympics. The 72 Summer Olympics were decent in Munich, especially with Mark Spitz getting all those gold medals. The West German organizing community said that they wanted to make sure that these games, the 1972 games, would basically destroy German stereotypes because of the last time the Olympics were hosted, it was 1936 because of Hitler's propaganda. There weren't too many special security personnel for some reason. The documentary film One Day in September claims that security in the athletes' village was unfit for the games, and athletes could come and go as they pleased. Athletes snuck past security and could go to other countries' rooms by going over the fencing that encompassed the village. In fact, the Israeli Olympic delegation was worried about the absence of armed personnel, and they had concern about the authorities and teams' lodgings. So actions were not really taken. All that. In 2012, the German news magazine Der Spiegel wrote that West German authorities had a tip-off from a Palestinian informant in Beirut 3 weeks before the massacre, because the informant told West Germany that Palestinians were planning something on the Olympic Games, and the foreign ministry in Bonn, Germany, viewed the tip-off seriously enough to pass it to the Secret Service of Munich and wanted security measures being taken. However, the authorities did not act on the tip and never acknowledged it for 40 years. The German authorities had mishandled it. So anyway, the Israeli athletes enjoyed a night out on September the 4th, watching a performance of Fiddler on the Roof and dining with the star, Israeli actor Shmuel Rodensky. So anyway, at 4:30 a.m. local time on September 5th, 1972, as the athletes slept, 8 tracksuit-clad members of the Black September faction of the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, carried duffel bags loaded with assault rifles, pistols, and grenades. They scaled the 600-foot chain-link fence with the assistance of unsuspecting athletes who were sneaking into the Olympic Village. Those athletes were claimed to be Canadians decades later. So basically, they found stolen keys to enter two apartments used by the Australians at Connolly Stash 31. Restaurant referee Josef Goodfruit was awakened by a scratching noise. When he investigated, the door began to open and a masked man had guns on the other side. He shouted a warning to his sleeping roommates and threw his 300-pound weight against the door in an attempt to stop the intruders from forcing their way in. Sadly, though, it failed miserably. Well, Gunford's actions gave his roommate, weightlifting coach, enough time to smash the window escape. Wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg fought the intruders, but shot him through his cheek, and then forced him to find more hostages. So, basically, weightlifter Yosef Romano attacked one of the intruders, but was shot and killed. Coach Weinberg knocked unconscious one of the intruders, but failed to draw blood from another with a fruit knife, and was shot to death. The gunman took 9 hostages. Goodfriend, the wrestling referee, sharpshooting coach Karat Shore, track and field coach Evisar Sapira, fencing member Andre Spitzer, weightlifting judge Yakov Springer, wrestlers Alistair Halford and Mark Slavin, and weightlifters David Berger and Sved Freeman. Berger actually had dual citizenship with the United States, and Slavin, only 18, the youngest of the hostages, only arrived in Israel from the Soviet Union 4 months before the Olympics began. So anyway, it was not that good and all that. The attackers were reported to be Palestinian terrorists and all that. So anyway, frankly, though, Uruguay and Hong Kong, who shared the building with Israel, actually escaped unharmed. Prime Minister of Israel Golda Meir said that they wanted other countries to save our citizens and condemn the criminal acts committed. If we give in, then no Israeli anywhere in the world will feel like his or her life is safe. It's blackmail of the worst kind. King Hussein of Jordan actually denounced the attack, even though that all the Arab country leaders were happy with it. Richard Nixon privately discussed a number of possible American responses, such as a National Day mourning, or have Nixon fly to the athletes' funerals. But anyway, there would have to be negotiations after killing the 2 people. So the hostage takers wanted 234 Palestinians and non-Arabs jailed in Israel, alongside 2 West German insurgents, in exchange for the hostages. They threw the body of Weinberg out the front door of the residence to demonstrate their resolve. Israel said, "We will not negotiate." Israel's policy at the time was to refuse to negotiate with terrorists under any circumstances. And it was claims that the German authorities, under Chancellor Willy Brandt, rejected Israel's offer to send a special forces unit to West Germany. Regardless, they found out a squad of 38 West German police officers were dispatched to the Olympic Village, dressed in Olympic sweatsuits. They were members of the German border police. They were looking for the attack and all that. In fact, camera crews would view the actions of the officers from the German departments and broadcast the amateurs live on TV. Thus, the terrorists were able to watch the police prepare to attack. And footage shows that one of the kidnappers peered through the balcony door while one of the police officers stood on the roof less than 20 feet from him. In the end, the police were detained after the man threatened to kill 2 of the hostages. So anyway, the Palestinians wanted a new dictation. They wanted transportation to Cairo. And the authorities said yes to the Cairo demand. That's fine. So they would bring 2 military helicopters to transport the terrorists and hostages to a NATO air base and then possibly head to Rheims and then to Egypt. However, there was a problem. At the last minute, once the helicopters landed at the NATO plant, the West German police aboard the airplane abandoned their mission and only got 5 sharpshooters to try to overpower the heavily armed group. So unfortunately, it failed. 2 of the kidnappers actually decided to throw a grenade into the airplane and kill all 9 over there. So it was easy. So yeah, so it was terrible and all that. The outcome was terrible. Some said that the hostages were alive and that the attackers were killed, but the initial reports were overly optimistic. Jim McKay, who was doing the Olympics for ABC, took the job of reporting the events as Rune Arledge fed him to its earpiece. At 3:24 a.m., I guess Munich time, I don't know if it's Munich or Eastern time, McKay gave the confirmation. We just got the final word. You know, when I was a kid, my father used to say, our greatest hopes and our worst fears are seldom realized. Well, our worst fears have been realized tonight. They've now said that there were 11 hostages. 2 were killed in the rooms yesterday morning. 9 were killed at the airport tonight. They're all gone. It was just shock. There was a lot of criticism and all that because West Germany was trying to avoid something having Germany as a bad country, especially after Hitler's propaganda. It all failed. The West Germans failed miserably. And all that. There was a lot of aftermath. 5 of the Palestinian attackers were killed during the gun battle. The bodies were delivered to Libya, buried with full military honors. Israeli planes would bomb 10 PLO bases in Syria and Lebanon in response to the massacre, getting militants and civilians, unfortunately. The 3 surviving Black September gunmen were arrested after the gunfight was put in Munich for trial. Lufthansa Flight 615, October of 1972, was hijacked and threatened to be blown up, but the Munich attackers were not released. West Germany decided to. So, yeah. It had a massive effect on the games. In the wake of the hostage-taking, competition was suspended for 34 hours. September 6th, there was a memorial service attended by 80,000 spectators and 3,000 athletes at the Olympic Stadium. Avery Brundage, who was the IOC president, made little reference to the murdered athletes during his speech, praising the strength of the Olympic movement and equating the attack on the Israeli sportsmen with the recent arguments about encroaching professionalism and dislowing Rhodesia's participation in the games. People were outraged. A cousin of the wrestling coach Weinberg actually collapsed and died of a heart attack. So, anyway. West Germany had a soccer match against Hungary, but several spectators referred to the 17 dead already forgotten. Well, the Munich organizing committee said we need to cancel the remainder of the games, but in the afternoon, Brundage prevailed. They could not let the incident halt the games. The games must go on, and we must continue our efforts to keep them clean, pure, and honest. And the Israeli government did endorse this move. So, Israel, after the memorial service, withdrew from the games and left Munich. All Jewish sportsmen were put under guard. Mark Spitz actually completed his competitions and left Munich anyway, so he could have been a target. Egypt left the games fearing reprisals. The Philippines and Algerian teams actually left the games too, as well as members of the Dutch and Norwegians. It was terrible. The Israeli team did commemorate the massacre 4 years later in Montreal. Their national flag was adorned with a black ribbon. So there were rumors that at the opening ceremony in 2012 at the London Games, there was going to be a minute of silence, but the IOC rejected it, saying it would be inappropriate for some reason. Rio and Tokyo Olympics had a moment of silence. All that. Israel did get those 3 PLO members that survived and were taken back. And there's a German cover back. So yeah, that was just so terrible and all that. There was an Academy Award for Best Documentary made one day in September. And then there's one about Munich 2005 by Steven Spielberg. Now, of course, there's a scathing editorial, as I said in the update to Black September. The Black September thing about Avery Brundage. And did he make the right move? It's hard to say, but I think he kind of made the right move. And Israel said it was okay, but then pulled their guys out of Munich. So, yeah. Now, of course, Brundage was accused, and probably is guilty in the court of public opinion, of putting the Olympics over everything else. Brundage was also known for, in his IOC campaign, of kind of being a Hitler sympathizer in a sense. But most of all, he basically cracked down on professionalism. He wouldn't let amateurs even get sponsored by professional companies, and basically didn't want any advertising and all that. So in the Olympics, it's not about advertising. I get his amateurism, but sometimes it went to extremes. He basically had it that many people who owned like clothing shops were banned from the Olympics and all that. Brundage was accused of just being a bit of a old-fashioned asshole, if you will. I mean, the guy was IOC president from 52 to 75. So, yeah, he was okay and all of that. But, of course, Brundage is also known for being a little bit of a xenophobe, if you ask me. A lot of people said that he purposely tried to make sure that Jim Thorpe or his family did not receive the gold medals in 1912 that were stripped from him for his professionalism playing Class A Carolina baseball. And that was the problem because of the fact that Jim Thorpe was accused 6 months after the Olympics ended. And amateur rules said that you had 30 days to get an inquiry about someone's amateur status. So basically, the time had passed. That's why Thorpe should have been given the gold medals. But unfortunately, they were stripped from him. And a lot of people did blame Brundage because he was actually in the pentathlon alongside Mr. Thorpe and didn't do so well. And probably thought it was just racism and or jealousy that, Brundage refused to let Thorpe have the medals. Eventually, in 1983, the IOC said, fine, they can have the gold medals. So they presented it to Thorpe's children. It was a shame that Brundage basically was kind of a dick and all that. And he might have been a massive dick towards Jesse Owens. Well, then again, America was a dick to him, not giving him proper hero's welcome coming back from the Olympics in Berlin in 1936. So, yeah, I really don't like the fact that Brundage basically was kind of a douchebag. I will never forgive him for what he did about Olympic atrocities. I never will. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond. I do.